Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In our last video, I showed you a config workflow that lets you swap out background for anything, whether it's a person or a product. The cool part, the background is generated by AI. But what if you already have a background? You want your subject to blend in seamlessly, right? That's why I took some time to create a new workflow specifically for that. Removing the background for a subject and placing them into a new scene is pretty straightforward. You can even do it in Photoshop. The tricky part comes when you need to relight the subject so they match the new surroundings. A lot of creators believe that the only way to do this is with IC Light, and many are still waiting for version 2 to be open sourced. But here's the surprise. I managed to relight my subjects in my workflow without using IC Light at all. I only use the Lightning version of the SDXL model and take just 5 sampling steps to get it done. Let me show you how. Here's the image I uploaded to fit into a new background, and here's the new background I chose. I used this workflow to remove the original white background, but it can also handle more complex backgrounds too. Now I've repositioned the subject in a new scene. Next, I utilized the Lightning version of the XDXL model to relight the subject. You can see the even generated shadows next to the shoes and the chair legs. Some details got a bit lost, but that's not a big deal. In the final step, I restored the original details while keeping the new highlights and shadows. Let's take a look at the image before and after relighting. If we zoom in, you'll notice that the original lighting on her legs comes from the right, and after relighting, the light now comes from the left. The shadows beside her shoes and the chair legs look super natural. This workflow also opens up a lot of creative possibilities. Let's check out another example. Here's the subject, a woman, and here's the background, a beach. I can use this workflow to place the woman right in the water. And here's the final image. Now her feet are submerged in the water, and you can even see her shadow on the surface. You might notice that her feet seem to have disappeared. That's because I erased them using the preview bridge node in the workflow. The shadow on the water and the visibility of her cows are thanks to using SDXL to redraw a custom area of the water. This workflow isn't just for people, it works great for product too. Let's take a look at 2 more examples. Now let me show you how to use this workflow. You'll find the download link in the video description, so be sure to check that out. Let's skip the other node groups for now and just keep the first group active. Now let's run the workflow to load the models. I've uploaded both the subject image and the background image. These 2 nodes help to limit the image size. You can adjust the scale to length parameter to control how big the images are. Now let's take a look at more nodes below. Here I've loaded the checkpoint and the ControlNet model, and I've set the ControlNet type. The BiRefNet model is what we use to remove the background from the subject image. There are 2 versions of this model available, and in most cases, their outputs will be quite similar. The ClipVariant model will work together with the IP adapter, which I'll show you later. Now let's move on to the second node group. I run the workflow to remove the background from the subject first. This node group is identical to the second one in the workflow from my last video, so I won't go into too much detail here. As you can see, the background removal is pretty precise. However, there are some shadows left under her shoes. Let's fix that in the preview bridge node. Great, now that we've made those adjustments, let's run the workflow again. Alright, we've successfully removed the background from the uploaded subject image. Now let's head over to the next group. Before I dive into the explanation, let me run the workflow first. As you can see from this image, this node group is what we use to position the subject in the background. I'm not sure if you have noticed that this background isn't the original anymore. It has been slightly blurred using these nodes above. The proposed depth map blur node allows us to blur the image based on a depth map. This means that the further something is in space, the blurrier it appears. The depth map itself is generated by the depth anything node. The main parameter we need to focus on is blur strength. This set of nodes lets us adjust the position of the subject and background. I won't go into too much detail here since these nodes appear in most of my previous workflows. The Florence 2-round nodes automatically generate prompts for us. If I want the generated prompt to be more detailed, I can set the text parameter to more detailed caption. Now the prompt is much longer. The Canny edge images will be used in the next group to help control the outline of the subject. We need to lower the threshold parameters until the outline of the subject becomes really clear. There are two versions of the Canny edge here. The first one shows the contour of both the subject and the background, while the second one focuses only on the subject itself. In most cases, you'll want to select the first option in the image input switch node. I'll explain when to choose the second option a bit later. Let's keep moving. This group allows us to repaint the image generated by the last group. This helps relight the subject and create shadows, so the subject blends naturally into the background. If you compare the generated image with the one from the last group, you'll notice that the highlights and the shadows have changed. It's true that some original details may be lost in this process, but that's not a big deal. We can easily recover those details in the final group, as long as the newly generated subject has the same outline as the original. That's why it's crucial to make the Canny edge as precise as possible in the last group. Now the real issue is that we need shadows on the floor around the woman. The previous repaint area only focused on her, so let's expand that area to include the floor. We can modify this area in the preview bridge node. Let's go ahead and do that now. Right now, the paint area doesn't have to be super precise since we can always adjust it later. Let's run the workflow again. We might need to change the seed in the case sampler and try a few more results, as the shadows will vary each time with a different seed. This process won't take long because we are using the Lightning version of the XDXL model, which only requires 5 sampling steps in the case sampler. So go ahead and try a few more times until the shadows look really natural. Now I've tried many times, but the shadows on the floor always look shattered and don't have much differences from the original shadows. So why is this happening? It's actually because the Canny edge we are using limits the shape of the shadows. As you can see, we are using the Canny edge generated from the image with the background. To fix this, we need to use the image switch node to select the subject outline as the contour image. After we make that switch, let's run the workflow again. Now you can see that the shadows on the floor look much more realistic, spreading evenly across the surface. It's a big improvement. The recommended sampler to use is DPM++ SDE, and I've set the scheduler to exponential to keep the composition from changing too much during this process. I won't go into the details of the rest of the nodes in this group right now, but I'll come back to explain them later. For now, let's activate the other node groups and run the workflow. Let's see what we can create. The remaining node groups are really helpful for recovering the details we lost during the repainting process. As you can see, I'm using the image detail transfer node to bring back most of the details. If the shadows aren't blending evenly on the face, you can increase the value of blur sigma or blur readers in the image blur node to help with that. Right now, the shadows aren't blending evenly on the floor, and we can fix this issue with the image detail transfer node since it only affects the details on the subject, not the background. Usually, we won't fix this problem. This task is quite challenging because the shadows on the floor of the original background are so shattered. This makes it hard to generate natural-looking shadows based on that. So we need to use a specific method to solve this issue. We'll tackle that problem later. For now, let's focus on understanding the entire process of recovering details. It's important to get a clear picture of how everything works before we make any adjustments. Let's dive into that. On the right, the color blend node helps us adjust the color to match the original image. The image detail transfer node needs two images and a mask. The target image has the right highlights and shadows, while the source image has the correct details. However, we don't want to pull in all the details from the original image. That's why we limit the detail region to just the subject using the subject mask. This image has the right highlights and shadows, and where does it come from? Let's take a step back and look at the process from the beginning. First, we use the image blend node to blend the layered image with the background image. We set the blend mode to darker, which means we are using the generated image from the fourth group to darken the background image. The background image comes from the third group, if you remember that. However, we don't need to darken the entire image. We only want to darken specific areas to create shadows. That's where the layer mask comes in. It's used to define the shadow areas, and it comes from the last group. First, I use this node to generate a shadow mask from the image in the last group, which is this image. Then I use the same node to create another shadow mask from the image in the third group, which is this image. After that, I perform the subject option on these two masks to get a shadow mask with a smaller range. Next, the preview bridge node lets us modify this mask. For example, I don't want the mask to cover the plant port on the floor, so I'll paint over the plot to exclude that area. We can also use the levels node to brighten the mask, making the shadows more visible in the final result. That's how we create the layer mask. Now let's head back to the final group. We've discussed how to generate shadows by darkening the area of the layer mask from the blending result of the layer image and the background image. Now this node is used to recover the highlights in the same area because we've set the blend mode to lighter. The node on the right helps us adjust the highlights and shadows. It darkens the shadows because the shadow brightness value is set below 1. Meanwhile, it lightens the highlights since the highlight brightness is set above 1. You can also modify the range of the shadows and highlights to get the effect you want. We still have some shadow issues on the floor in the final result image because the shadows are mainly created by adjusting the brightness of the original background. To fix this, we need to switch to a new background image, which actually comes from the fourth node group. This new background has the repainted shadow area along with the rest of the original background. Now let's run the workflow and take a look at the final result image. As you can see, the shadows on the floor look better now. However, the texture of the flooring in the shaded area doesn't quite match the surrounding flooring, and the transition areas feel a bit unnatural. Let's make the masks blurrier and run the workflow again. Alright, the image is ready. This time, the texture is still not great. We can generate a few more times until we get the result we like. Let's also adjust the mask to exclude the plant plot, making the repainting only affects the floor. Great, this time the result is much better. Oh, I forgot to mention that we can also use the levels node to darken the shadows on the floor. Let's slide this slider to increase the value of the black point. After that, let's run the workflow again. Now you can see that the shadows on the floor are much darker, so the Levels node is also a great tool for modifying shadows. In this example, the new background image is primarily used to fix existing problems. However, it can also open up exciting new creative possibilities. Remember the beach image I showed you at the beginning of the video? The pixels in the shadow area of the final result image don't come from the original background. Instead, they were generated in the fourth group. Finally, in the last group, the new background with the generated shadows is used as a background image. This design gives you a lot of creative freedom, so I encourage you to try out this workflow and explore some really cool ideas.